We're so excited to have you join us this evening for the first in what we hope to be a new series of art talks around the history of monotypes and monoprints. We have a full house tonight, so we're also going to be live streaming this to Facebook, which is exciting. So we just ask for a little bit of tech patience. All right, so for those who don't know me, welcome. My name is Rebecca Leopoldina-Torres, and I'm currently serving as the president of the Monotype Guild of New England. And I'll also be serving as the moderator for our Q&A later on. On behalf of the Guild, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for our art talk with art historian Alexandra Onuf on experimental impressions, the 17th century origins of monotype. Like all of you, I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion around the origins of the monotype print and how Rembrandt laid the experimental foundations for the monotype revival in the 19th century by Degas and his circle. So before we start, I'd like to begin today by respectfully acknowledging the Indigenous cultures of New England. As the Monotype Guild is based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we join you from the ancestral homeland of the Massachusetts people and the Wampanoag tribe. I would like to recognize them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. This land is a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. And so in that tradition, we look forward to our meeting and exchange tonight with you all. So we have artists, art scholars, and print enthusiasts joining us from all over the US and beyond. So whether you're joining us in our webinar format, via Facebook Live, or watching this recording at a later date, we're grateful for you and we're happy that you're able to be here with us today. For those of you who are not so familiar with the Monotype Guild of New England, we are a volunteer-run nonprofit printmaking organization consisting of over 250 contemporary artists who are creating unique impressions by working in the medium of monotypes and monoprints. None of our board members or volunteers are paid. All the work that we do, including our free virtual programs like today's art talk, are an expression of our passion for our craft and our larger artists and printmaking community. So all of this is primarily funded by our membership dues, donations, and the submission fees for our exhibition. So I just wanted to take this moment to thank all of our members and volunteers who have donated their time and worked tirelessly to keep this organization not only running, but growing and thriving during these unprecedented times. So while our current exhibitions are on hold for the time being, we have a wide range of upcoming artist demos, artist talks, meetups, etc. scheduled for the next couple of months. So please go to our website at mjne.org for more information. And then finally, a few logistics for you. So for those of you joining us from Zoom, you will notice that you're muted and we can't see you. But we ask that you submit your questions in the Q&A box that should be at the bottom or side of your screen. Today's presentation will be approximately 45 minutes, and then we will have dedicated the last 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. And I can add that, go ahead and put your questions in the box during the presentation, but we'll try to get to them at the end. And for those of you who are joining us from Facebook Live, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on that as well. So now that all that housekeeping is out of the way, I am very pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Alexandra Onuf, also known as Z. Z is an associate professor of art history at the University of Hartford, specializing in early modern landscape prints. She's published widely in this field, including her 2018 monograph, The Small Landscape Prints in Early Modern Netherlands. She also has a recent article on Rembrandt entitled Secrets of the Dark, Rembrandt's Entombment circa 1654, which we will be discussing in more detail today. So with all that, I'm going to turn it over to Z.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you also, Rebecca and Carol, for inviting me and for doing all of these tremendous technological master strokes to get this off the ground tonight. I really appreciate all the hard work that takes. And thank you all from around the nation and the globe for joining us this evening. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you here to talk about some of my very, very favorite artists. I'm mindful that many of you are artists and practitioners yourselves who undoubtedly know a great deal more about the kinds of processes and the possibilities of these techniques than I ever will as an art historian. But I do hope that today we can spend some time together looking at an artist who I consider really the first great monotype artist, Edgar Degas, and to consider how his really very radical and experimental approach really finds its roots actually in the 17th century in the work of Rembrandt, who is one of my favorites. You see examples of two of their prints here on this introductory slide here, and we'll return to those later on in the talk. There's so much that I wanted to show this evening and to share. Rebecca can attest to this. So this is really, as much as I've been able to sort of edit it down to a kind of an essential group of images, I think that I hope will be resonant and exemplary. But just know that there's much, much more that could and should be said about both of these artists and indeed the other artists working in their orbits. But I wanted to make sure that we have time to explore the images that we look at carefully and closely, and also that there's plenty of time for us to open up for discussion at the end. So with that, let's take a look first at Degas and then try to see if we can see connections and commonalities with the approach that he takes to printmaking with that of Rembrandt earlier in the 17th century. So just to start things off, when we think of Degas, we probably think first of him as a painter and perhaps also as a sculptor. I show you here two examples. The dance class of 1874 hangs in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Some of you perhaps have had the great good fortune to see it in person. And then the little dancer aged 14 is in fact on display in the National Gallery. And this is a very, very well-known and beloved work to many because it was cast in bronze many, many times after the artist's death. So it sort of took on a life of its, an afterlife, if you will. And I think here we can see Degas working with one of his most favorite themes. Again, if we think of Degas, we probably think of dancers. And here you can see that certainly on display. The painting is really quite ambitious. There's quite a large number of figures packed into this scene. It was first intended to be exhibited in the 1874 Impressionist exhibition, which was the first of its ilk, but later was actually shown in 1876 because the project took too long and it became a very involved undertaking. When it was displayed, Degas' friend and the great artist Mary Cassatt saw it and described it as more beautiful than any Vermeer I ever saw, which I think is a lovely way to start things off because it really does connect already for Cassatt this idea that Degas is working kind of in the tradition of these Dutch masters like Johannes Vermeer. And yet he's taking on a distinctly modern subject. When we think of Degas, we think of him as a painter and an artist of modern life. And here you can see that, perhaps, I think you can see my little pointer here. If there's a mirror on the wall of this dance studio where this lesson is taking place, we can see out through the mirror, through a window, presumably on the opposite side of the room, the smokestacks of the new modern city of Paris. The dancers are part of the opera ballet corps of the Paris Opera, a place that Degas was very familiar with and spent a great deal of time observing and sort of mingling with this new kind of theatrical entertainment and leisure of the city. The composition is really quite striking. You'll notice that there's these kind of really daring, bold compositional choices that he makes. This standing bass that you can see kind of like juts out at us at this strange and vertiginous angle. It's cut off at the edge. You have all of these dancers who we think would be elegant and refined, many of whom are hiking up their skirts and like fidgeting with their necklaces in sometimes very ungainly poses, seated, practicing, getting ready for their turns to perform for the great ballet master here, the teacher Perrault. Who's shown standing at the edge of the scene. And there's this great empty void kind of right in the center bottom right of the scene. So in some ways, sort of defying all of the traditional compositional expectations that we might have for a large, say, history painting or something of that sort. And in its own way, The Little Dancer, age 14, is quite startling as well. You can see this is a list of some of the materials that Degas used to create this sculpture, but it's actually even more than this. And in fact, better than a sculpture, we might call it a kind of mixed media work, in fact, built up with wax, with clay over a metal armature. He uses rope, there's human hair in there, there's lots of silk ribbons and a cotton bodice, a silk tutu. So he's really sort of beginning to think of this kind of liberating idea that you should use whatever materials you can to convey the necessary and desired effect. And I think we'll see that take root or take flight, you might say, in his work in printmaking. So this sets the stage, I think, for us about Degas, thinking about modern life, working in materials and with composition in some pretty remarkable ways. He also made a number of prints. He was never trained professionally as a printmaker, but we know that he made a number of etchings and experimented with things like soft ground etching as opposed to hard ground etching. He also worked with aquatint, dry point. He really sort of tried out all of the different sort of tools in the box, if you will. He even made some lithographs in his time. And here you can see too, I think, with his etching, that he's using a lot of the same sorts of strokes that you might with a drawing. So he's using that soft ground etching, which allows for a much quicker stroke and a much looser kind of almost drawn crayon-like quality to the lines that he creates. He also, I couldn't resist putting this print into this talk this evening because I love it so much. It's so unusual in the compositional choice and the vantage point that he sets for us. It's as though we're sort of down in the midst of the orchestra pit, sort of looking up at the stage, as opposed to seeing the theatrical stage spread out before us, easily visible. The head of the standing bass kind of blocks our view of the dancers. In fact, we see the figures of the orchestra, their faces literally sort of cut off as though they're trying to keep their heads above water. It's a remarkable image, I think. And it gives you a sense of just how experimental Degas was. One of his friends, Pissarro, once called him an anarchist, not in politics, but in art. And I think we can already get the sense of the way that he's really sort of trying to not necessarily break rules for the sake of it, but to break rules in order to open up new sort of opportunities for ways of seeing things and ways of representing things. But for me, and I think for many, Degas is truly at his most radical and his most experimental when he begins to experiment with monotype. This starts in the early 1870s. And these seem to have become really quite a passion for Degas once he begins to become familiar with the technique and the medium. He produces over 450 monotypes in the course of a couple of decades. He reworks about 80 of them with pastel. So he's thinking about these two as a kind of mixed media technique. The French art critic Arsène Alexandre described him in this way. He says, his monotypes represent the area of his work in which he was most free and most alive and most reckless, not hampered by any rule. And he became so fixated with monotypes, apparently, that at one moment, a friend met him on the streets of Paris and sort of described him as so dirty and so covered with printer's ink and so sort of like obsessed with monotypes that it looked as though he'd become a printing plate himself. Or just this kind of tremendous conflation of the artist with his materials in that observation, which I think is really quite telling. Now, I know I'm not going to be telling many of you anything you don't know, but for those of you who might not be familiar, monotypes are really essentially a fairly simple technique. It had first been invented in the 17th century, excuse me, by Castiglione, who worked in Italy, and especially in Rome, but had really sort of not been used until we see this great flourishing with Degas. What it required was simply a printing plate. Degas tended to use copper plates, but instead of etching into the surface to create a fixed matrix, monotypes simply involved painting or drawing directly on the surface of the metal plate instead of cutting into it, and then running that plate with paper through a printing press. So as a result, because it's not a fixed image, you really just get one primary impression. You can then run that plate through the press again with another piece of paper, and you get what we would call a cognate or a ghost impression. And sometimes you can even get a third, but it's a kind of fleeting technique. Some art historians have talked about it as kind of a hybrid or a sort of median spot between drawing on the one hand and printmaking on the other, because it has those qualities of both and neither sort of at the same time in a really interesting way. But what I think drew Degas to this process, particularly as he's thinking about trying to represent modern life and his new experiences, his new way of seeing, was that it's really an unfixed medium. So until you run that plate through the press, there's nothing holding that image in fixity. You can, it's malleable, you can move that ink around right up to the last moment. And indeed, when it runs through the press has its own part to play in that process. So as a result, it's really a technique of improvisation, of variation, that I think Degas gravitated towards precisely for its lack of fixity, its spontaneity, its improvisatory quality. And that's really an interesting thing too, because that refusal of precision, you can see, I think also in these two examples relatively early in Degas' engagement with monotype, tend to lend themselves to this more tonal quality, as opposed to a very clear linearity or sort of what we might call draftsman-like quality, which is super interesting because Degas, we know, tremendous draftsman. And in fact, early in his career had been really interested in sort of classicism. He went to Italy, he drew after all of the great masters, Michelangelo, Raphael. He met the great artist Ingres, who told him, "Draw lines, young man, and still more lines, both from life and from memory, and you will become a good artist." So this was the sort of classicizing tradition that Degas had come up in. And now all of a sudden he discovers this medium that asks him instead to let go, to release that idea of mastery and control, and to work with these materials, this ink, in a much more visceral, tactile kind of way that refuses precision and really creates a new sort of relationship between artist and medium. To take just a quick look at these two in particular, if we look at the heads of a man and a woman on the left-hand side, this is actually a fairly tiny print. It's only about 3 inches by 3 inches. And what we see is an image that's known as a light field manner monotype, which is to say that Degas used this thick, sort of tacky printer's ink to paint the figures onto the surface of the metal plate, which is quite small. And in doing so, you can see that he seems to have quite deliberately sort of rejected the norms of, say, portraiture or even pictorial representation by taking a cloth or a rag and literally sort of blurring out the faces of these two figures. I saw this at an exhibition when it was on display in New York at the Museum of Modern Art. And it was just like, took me aback because it is so shocking in some ways to see that refusal of the very thing that we think of when we see a figure, we look to the face, right? We want to identify. And here Degas has taken that away quite deliberately with those quick strokes of his rag. And indeed, I think it says something about his desire to try to capture bodies and gestures in motion, right? We can see these bodies as though they turn and move on the street. and that Degas only gotten a kind of sidelong glance at them as they pass each other on the busy sidewalk. And it's interesting too, in that respect, that Degas has placed them without any kind of context. There's no setting, there's no background or backdrop that would place these figures and situate them. They seem to be kind of free floating as a result, which is super interesting, I think, too. The factory smoke that we see here on the right-hand side is interesting also from technical and also from compositional perspectives as well, because it's not common, even at this time in the 19th century, to take as your subject smoke. In fact, we don't even see the buildings really that are producing the smoke, the factories. It's just that kind of atmospheric, billowing quality, the diffuse quality of the smoke itself. And this is also super interesting because this is a print that combines that light field technique, which I talked about, which Degas used here in the bottom portion where we see the sort of plumes of smoke rising. But the top portion of this print is actually done in what's called dark field technique. So here what Degas did was spread that printer's ink across the entire surface and then use a rag to work it back, to lighten it up, to spread it thinner. In fact, he then also used his fingers to smudge between where the area of the dark field and the light field meet. So you can see his fingerprints if you get a magnifying glass. You can see his fingerprints all over this. And then when printed on a sort of damp and absorbent paper, you can see the way that that ink begins to spread and really have that kind of more diffuse quality, that mutability that he seems to have sought as so apropos of the subject, right? Of so clearly capturing the quality of that evanescent smoke. It's also worth noting, this is a really interesting anecdote, I think, that there's also a kind of material link between the smoke and the ink, because we know that Degas used lamp black printer's ink, which is actually produced from soot, and potentially the kind of soot that might have been billowing out of these factory smokestacks. So there is a sense in which here, I think Degas is also drawing on a real sort of material sense of his technique and also of the materials he's using as being especially sort of appropriate to the subject he's choosing. So as I said, these are two sort of early examples and relatively small. The factory smoke is a little bit larger. It's about 5 inches by 6.5 inches in size, but still relatively petite. Probably one of the largest monotypes that Degas produces is this one known as the Fireside, which is about 16.5 by 23 inches. So this is a substantial image. And it's interesting that this is one of only a small number of really intimate interior scenes in a brothel with more than one figure. We can see two women here who are on either side of the composition around a fireplace that seems to glow in the sort of center of this image. And this again, as you can, I think, probably gather, is a dark field monotype. So the entire surface was covered with that thick, tacky printer's ink. And then Degas used a variety of techniques, whatever he had to hand at the studio, to sort of wipe away that ink, to work from dark to light, to have the image emerge, if you will, from the ink. So we know that he used a dauber to sort of put that ink down and then wiped with fabric rags. He used a stiff brush down here on the floor to create this kind of striated effect. He used sponges in some areas to create a more sort of stippled quality. He turned his paintbrush around and used its sharp edge to create some of these starker white lines that we see throughout, over here as well. And again, his fingers throughout. So there's this incredible sense of the kind of visceral, physical engagement of the artist with his medium, with his technique here, which I think Degas really kind of got into and used. particularly for this really intimate kind of interior scene. He only used monotype, or how to put this, he only represented the interior of brothels in monotype. So while we find him using pastels to show women at the bath or dancers and ballerinas and so on, these kind of interiors that are more explicit in their subject matter, you might say, he reserves those images for this monotype technique, as though somehow the intimacy of the process relates to the subject he's representing. And to me, it's just so striking, the bodies of these two women that seem to have, to me, a kind of sculptural quality, you know, that he's worked their form almost like you might clay. And remember, he was a sculptor too. And there's that sense of his working the ink as you might another kind of sculptural subject or material to create these forms out of the ink. So again, these are not forms that are created by line or by contour, but rather through essentially chiaroscuro, through light and shade, through the use of ink and those tonalities that you get between black and white. And here again, we see this kind of obscurity. If you remember the faces that he blurred on the city street, here too, for me, there's a kind of inscrutable quality. Like we look and we can't quite see everything clearly. We can't sort of figure out the transparent reality of what we see. The perspective is also kind of wonky. I mean, the fireplace seems to sort of jig up. It's as though there's this kind of weird center of gravity in this body of the woman at the left-hand side, as though, I don't know, she's so heavy that she weights down the whole scene. And it feels like what we get here is not then a record of an observation, but a kind of an image that we have to work our way into through the ink, through the physicality, in order to sort of try to figure out what we're seeing. So in some way, we're made aware of our own seeing, right? We're sort of made conscious of the hard work it takes to figure out what we're looking at. And that's, I think, particularly interesting given the subject of a brothel. This is also a moment when sort of early pornographic images of women and prostitutes were available on the market, but these are not that kind of image that allow for our sort of immediate consumption and visual pleasure. In fact, to me, it looks like these women couldn't care less that we're even here. They're totally unaware and not interested in us. Their gestures are difficult to kind of figure out or understand, but they seem very clearly sort of these autonomous forms that we have a certain distance to, that we're not given access to in an interesting way. Degas also, a little bit later in the 1890s, experimented with landscape. This is where I get really excited, because here we can see, I think, a step towards almost pure abstraction. So these are interesting for a couple of reasons. Degas, we know, took trips out into the countryside, first in a moving carriage, and then later on a second trip on a train. So there's this idea of speed and movement and the shifts in vision and the sort of scopic regime that creates, that he's perhaps trying to capture here in these set of landscapes that he does as monotypes. And it's interesting also because he's using oil paints here instead of that tacky, thick, viscous printer's ink, that black ink, that lamp black. So it, to use a technical term, it sort of smooshes differently when it runs through the press. Like it spreads and moves differently as an oil compared to that thick printer's ink. And you get completely different kinds of effects, like this kind of skittering quality that you see that almost suggests rather than shows the form of a lake in the Pyrenees. In fact, Degas put on a show of these at the Durand-Ruel Gallery in Paris in 1892. He almost like didn't even advertise it, just like he didn't want anybody to come. But one critic did, and he described these landscapes as, quote, chimerical scenes recalled from the imagination. So this idea of the chimera, that this is imagination that is being brought to bear on observation, and that what we find is that sort of blending or merging of vision with the mind, or the sort of sense of a scene, as opposed to the optical, quote unquote, reality or observed form of a scene. So it's a completely new, I think, mode of perception. And it's interesting to me that Degas uses monotype as the most appropriate medium for capturing those kinds of qualities, that chimeric quality that he's so fascinated with. Now, gosh, time is flying, so I'm going to try to speed things up here. But we know that monotypes of the type that we've been looking at have been sort of more or less, quote unquote, independent works, or sort of autonomous works. But he also used a number of his monotypes as the sort of basis or the groundwork, almost a kind of tonal map over which he would then overlay pastels. As for example, here, this is what looks to be a pastel drawing. In fact, it's done over a monotype base. And in that sense, we can think here too of Degas using monotypes together with other media as a kind of mixed medium, again, in the same way that he thought about sculpture in a similarly kind of open-ended way. So this is heavily worked. You can barely, I think, see the monotype underneath or find it beneath the pastel. Here we see perhaps Degas' very, very first monotype. This is the first pull or the first impression. And you can see that he's begun to sort of heighten it with some colored chalk, white chalk, and sort of this blue tone of wash that you see here over that black matte printer's ink. It's interesting because we know from there's a second pull or a second impression of this particular print, and you can see what happens when he then works it over with gouache and with pastel. It's the same foundation, but transformed. And to me, this sort of shows the way that Degas is thinking about monotypes as a way of sort of an iterative process, as a set of variations of possibilities that can be exploited and taken in different directions. He's adding figures here, he's adding forms and colors and an entire sort of narrative that we don't sense here in the first pull. And just by the by, out of interest, this same dance master that we see here is the same guy we saw in that painting at the beginning. This is famous teacher Perrault at the Paris Opera. You may also have noticed, if you were a close looker, that there is a detail up here at the top that might be worth noting. We know that Degas signed this work, or sort of in the ink, scratched his name, but it's not just his name. There's a second name that appears here, Le Pic. Indeed, Degas' first monotype seems to have been done in conjunction with a friend and collaborator, Ludovic Le Pic, who was himself an amateur artist and an inventor and a close friend of Degas. And it was probably Le Pic who introduced Degas to this entire medium of monotype, and they worked together on this image. Le Pic, interesting character, was one of a number of artists who were involved in a movement we might call the Etching Revival. It's often called the Etching Revival, which got started in the 1860s, so just in the decade prior to when Degas got involved with monotypes. And this was an effort or a group of artists, including amateurs, but also etchers, painters, some professional printers and printmakers, who sought to sort of reclaim printmaking, especially etching, as an artistic medium. And this is an interesting moment because it's not as though nobody was making etchings in the 1860s. Quite the contrary, etching had become an incredibly sophisticated skilled printmaking medium that was used primarily for reproductive prints, which is to say, large quantities of essentially identical images produced with a very, very high level of skill, often for very wide audiences. There were travel books, advertisements, broadsides, reproductions of paintings, especially Turner paintings. Imagine that. So when we think of the etching revival, we have to understand that it's not that nobody was making etchings, but that this was a group of artists who sought to recapture what they thought of as something more artistic. They saw these reproductive prints as somehow static, uninspired, dull, too slick, lacking in spirit. So they sought instead to make what they called original prints, more authentic, ones that showed the handwork of the artist, the spirit, if you will, of the artist, that reflected something of the spontaneity of the artistic process, that emphasized tonal qualities over linear clarity and concision. So they experimented, and Ludovic Lepic was one of these experimenters who invented what he called variable etching. And essentially what he sought to do was to create an etched matrix and then ink it differently each time he ran it through the press. He would do this almost kind of maniacally, I have to say, so that he could create a sort of variable series of very different images from a single matrix. We would call these, I think now, mono prints, not strictly exactly monotypes, because there is that intaglio matrix. But what we see here, I'll just show you some brief examples of this particular case, the Dutch landscape with windmills. One example, a second, inked differently, wiped carefully to create this effect of this setting, I think, sun, maybe moon rising, and the sort of striations of the sky. And yet a third example, very dark, suddenly there's trees in the foreground. And it looks very ominous and mysterious. Lepic at one point, he does one print of the view of the River Schelde in Antwerp, and makes something like 80 different impressions of it, all slightly different to give a sense of different moods, seasons, times of day. And this is interesting, if, you know, for an amateur artist, a lot of these prints were derided as somehow being using this variable inking as a technique to cover up essentially an inability to draw well, right? That these were not great artists, so to cover up for their not great art, they would just shove a lot of ink onto the surface and print it. So there's this muddy quality, perhaps, that more purist printmakers would sort of look at with disdain. But I think what it demonstrates, and what it certainly seems to have sparked in Degas, was this idea that, oh, wow, you can really do so much with the tonality of ink. You can really understand ink as a collaborative element in the printmaking process that has expressive qualities of its own, that can be used in both unpredictable ways and in ways that you might begin to tease out of the materials themselves. And it's interesting because Lepic writes an entire treatise about this kind of technique, and he links his process directly to Rembrandt. So I'll just read this quite briefly, a portion of his treatise. He says, "I was struck by the falseness of modern engraving at the time. It had become as dry as it had become fine. It had rejected or repudiated the art of the masters, namely the art of Rembrandt, where one finds such powerful effects. It had repudiated them, I say, in refusing to use the printer's ink, which alone permits their being obtained." So it's interesting, and Lepic was not alone. Lepic and Degas were certainly not alone in sort of admiring Rembrandt at this moment in the 19th century. In fact, Rembrandt was widely praised for having inked and printed his own plates. He made about 300 etchings, He had a press in his own workshop, and he reworked his plates many, many times, often through very different states, and was clearly interested in tonality. So if we look at a print like this, the Dutch landscape, and then a print like this, the Three Crosses by Rembrandt, I mean, Rembrandt is an amazing artist, Lepic, you know, but there's definitely, I think, a sense of the connection that you can see Lepic looking at a print like this and saying, ah, exactly, because here you can see Rembrandt really sort of working with the plate and working with the ink in a way that directly inspires the way that Lepic thinks about these things centuries later. It's worth noting that Rembrandt never made a monotype avant la lettre. Like, he never simply uses a plate for a monotype. He's always working from an intaglio etched matrix. But I think that his approach to that intaglio technique really shows us the direction, the spirit that Lepic and Degas would take up, as did those of the Etching Revival. And Rembrandt, we know, was really fascinated by the process and the techniques, the material properties of ink, and especially papers and different kinds of surfaces, and how they could be manipulated and used, especially over time through different states, through variations and iterations. So this, as you can see, this is a very, very famous print known as the Three Crosses, which we're seeing here in the fourth state. So this is the fourth version, if you will, that he's intervened on the etched surface for four different ways at this point. Now, this is interesting too. It's large. It's about 15 by 17 inches, huge. And it's done entirely in dry point. So if you're a practitioner out there, you're kind of probably like hitting your head against a wall. How do you make something that big entirely of dry point and then print it through 4 states? In fact, at this point, we know that there had been about 53 impressions already pulled from this plate before he gets to the 4th state. And in total, there's 95 that are known today, probably more that maybe have been lost over time. Using the dry point needle, he's working directly on the copper plate. So no etching ground, no acid bath. He's sort of just pushing that needle into the metal, raising up burr that's gonna, from the metal plate, that's gonna hold on to ink when it's run through the press. And as a result, you can see that there's this very thick, heavy inked quality here, because that dry point is holding on to a lot of ink. And Rembrandt has also really laid it on and then wiped it away very strategically. So he's done a very careful job of wiping the ink away, particularly in this central area. And the sides are left in deep, deep shadow, to the point where this is called the Three Crosses, right? Can you find the 3rd cross? It's over here. It's almost entirely obscured by this sort of veil of darkness that seems to have fallen here. And there's this entire area in the immediate right foreground that's almost impossible to see. So, I mean, it's interesting because if we compare this to the 1st state, we can see just how radically this composition has changed over the course of these states. Where in fact, not only do we see a heavier ink as he's gone back and continued to work that surface with the dry point needle, but if we look closely, there are whole figures who seem to have been completely transformed, turned around, moved into different positions. And the entire mood, I think, has shifted. And this is interesting because Peter Parshall and other art historians have talked about the way in which this might represent a shift in narrative moment, that as we move through the different states, Rembrandt is actually moving us through the story. This is a biblical story that is told in at least 3 of the Gospels. When Christ is crucified, when he dies, that the sky goes dark, that the world goes dark at that very moment. And it's a sign of his divinity. And proves to the assembled figures here the divinity of this man. So what we see then is the sky going dark, right? We're following that moment where we're actually seeing Christ still alive on the cross, perhaps in this first state, to the very moment when that life extinguishes. And it's through the ink and it's through the sort of surface that Rembrandt is able to tell that story. And that's really interesting because it also creates a kind of new relationship for us as the viewers as we look at these plates and these impressions of having to engage in this really sort of deliberate way, state by state. Now I'm going to skip over a couple in the interest of time, I think, but you might notice that he's working also with different papers. So states and different papers which will produce different effects, have different absorbencies, particularly paper that was imported from Japan, and also China was super interesting for Rembrandt. He does this other very large print, maybe even as a pendant to the three crosses, known as the Ecce Homo, or the Christ presented to the people. Again, in this case, through 8 different states on different kinds of paper. He cuts down the plate, he moves the people around. Notice the figures in the immediate foreground where Christ is being presented up at this dais. Over time, those figures get more articulated, and then they get obliterated here in the most radical shift in the 6th state. And I'm not going to linger on this, but it's really interesting because what happens when those figures get removed is that not so much we change the narrative, but we change our involvement as viewers, right? Suddenly now we are in the position of that crowd, and we are the ones being asked by Pontius Pilate, who shall be saved and who shall be crucified? And it puts a whole different sort of perspective on the way that we engage with the image and with the biblical story. And the very last state, he continues to go back, again, this is entirely dry point, and creates these 2 dark, cavernous kind of holes or caverns at the bottom of that stage-like dais or platform, maybe canals, maybe moving to the underworld, maybe a tomb, a foretelling or foreshadowing of the crucifixion and the entombment to come. But it's really, I think, interesting that the mutability that Rembrandt brings to his plates, that they're not fixed, right? It's as though he keeps thinking through them and on them with each different state and each different iteration. They're not something that's simply meant to create identical images repeatedly, but variations, changes. Now, I'm going to leave time for questions, I swear it, but I just can't help but show you a couple of these entombment plays, because I think these are really, in some ways, the most radical of Rembrandt's engagement with printmaking. In fact, the art historian Christopher White has observed that every impression of this print is essentially so unique as to be like a monotype. He makes that direct comparison. So this is the first state. This is an etching, not a dry point. And you can see it's fairly loose, gestural, but also clear. And we can see the figure of Christ being lowered into a tomb. Here at the bottom, we have Mary sort of mourning at the far left-hand side, and some sort of hidden light source. Notice what happens in the second state. He's gone over the entire thing with dry point, and it's as though he seeks to obliterate the entire image, lets the ink, that plate tone, build up on its surface, and withholds in some way that image from us, the viewer. Again, putting us in the spot of having to sort of fill in the blanks, having to work to find the image within, and to imagine the kind of meditative state that we might inhabit should we be in that dark tomb ourselves. So there's so many more to see. I'm just gonna, he does this on vellum. You can see the sort of warmer glow that you get with that vellum. He does this and works on the ink in the back to create what look like Gothic windows for some reason, all with the ink. So in that sense, this is truly kind of monotype work right here, because there's no etching there that is producing that. This is a single impression. And then this is the third state, worked even further gone. You know, it's as though if you didn't know the print already from earlier states, you would have no idea what you're looking at. Like, it's just inscrutable in that way. You'll have to excuse me, I wrote about this print, so I get very excited about it. But just to conclude, and I want to give us some time for questions, I think I want to end with these two images that we started with juxtaposed right at the beginning, because for me, what we see when we put them next to each other is not a sort of direct line of influence so much, or a clear sense that, oh, Degas was looking at this particular Rembrandt print, but rather a kind of confluence of technical interest on the one hand, this idea of variable inking, selective wiping, of using your fingers, which we know Rembrandt did as well, using rags, using whatever comes to hand. An interest in process and materials, a real understanding of inks and its physical qualities, of paper and how that sort of engages in the process of art making, and the kinds of unexpected results that might happen when you run an image through a press, because who knows. And then finally, I think perhaps most importantly, there's this kind of shared conceptual approach to printmaking here. The idea that this is a medium that allows for what we might call unique impressions, you know, singular multiples of a sort that Rembrandt seems to have embraced, and which Degas sort of took and ran with. Because these are prints that I think are sort of freed from the constraints or demands of reproductive printmaking, or this idea that they have to be identical, that they engage with the somatic kind of physicality of the artist in the making process, and that they open up new possibilities for representation. I think both artists are really interested in challenging us to see in different ways through prints, that they are opportunities for us to find new ways to see either outwardly the world around us, or inwardly in this kind of more internal, meditative almost state with Rembrandt, and indeed I think with Degas as well. So I'll end on that note. And this is really more suggestive than determinative, but I would love to hear if you have any questions or thoughts, or any ideas or images that you'd like to go back to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Z. This was amazing. I mean, there's just so much interesting things here to kind of dig into. And I know we have a very limited amount of time. I do have to say, I know that you're preparing to teach a history of printmaking course, and I'm jealous of your students because I just want to learn more. And we'll have to have you come back to talk more about the subject. But yeah, we have a lot of questions. Particularly around, you know, the actual practice of making prints. But I think I'm going to be selfish and ask my question first. I think what really surprised me, because when I was familiar with Degas, I'm most familiar with the pastel, you know, the pastels where he's covering over the monotypes. And what really surprised me was, you know, like you said, like these abstract prints that were coming out in the 1870s, and then like the ones in color. And the print of the factory smoke reminds me of, you know, Monet's really famous paintings of the St. Lazare train station that he did. In fact, there's one in the Harvard Art Museums where I work that I just usually love to go look at. And I believe he painted it at the exact same time in 1877 as well. So it's fascinating to see these connections and how they were in communication with each other, but doing things completely fascinating, differently. But yeah, I think the print that really kind of completely threw me was the color, oil color of a lake in the Pyrenees. I mean, it just blows my mind. It's so abstract. And so one of the questions we got about that is the questions of, do you know if he put that through the press, or it looks like one of Phyllis was saying it looks like it was actually hand printed. Do you know if he was actually also just kind of making it work?
He did both. So we know that, you know, the sort of old back the spoon trick, that he did do that. And that would be more possible with the oil paints than it would be potentially with that printer's ink. he does a whole bunch of landscapes, and some of them are in principle and then also cognates. And many of them he then heightens with pastel, much in the way that he does with the Café Concert and things like this, although to a less sort of finished, you might say, degree. Whether or not they all went through the press is not entirely clear, but we know that he went to a friend of his house out in the countryside and said, "Oh, look, you have a press. Oh, do you have a metal plate? You know, do you have a copper plate? Let's get going." And he literally just, you know, forget introductions, rolled up his sleeves and started, you know, mucking around in the paint and used the press. So even for a bunch of these landscapes, we know that he was using a press. And that's one of the really interesting things, that you can see that he's thinking about what happens differently when you use oils that have this slightly more fluid quality. Compared to the inks that he had been using primarily for the black images in Paris. So there's this really interesting way in which it's just another kind of experiment, and he did everything in all ways. So, you know, he tried hand printing lots of things. There's tons of experiments that were found in his studio that were not finished monotypes, in the sense that they were presented or given to friends or signed even, where he seems to have been sort of like, well, what happens if I do this or this? And hand printing was certainly amongst those experiments that he tried.
Yeah, that's great. You know, there's a ton of questions about variable etching, and, you know, about, you know, Lepec's claim to have invented it. And you know, when Rembrandt was really, you know, working in it, and there's a lot of questions here about it, but Lynn mentioned that, you know, it's not more about how they're inking the plates, and even this was Degas, it's like what you were talking about, the sculptural quality of how they're wiping the ink away.
Totally. Yeah.
And how that's, you know, a different way of looking at it.
Yeah, it's kind of this combination of sort of the inking, but then also the wiping, the selective inking, the selective wiping, that work in conjunction. So for example, in this image here that we're still looking at of the fire seaside scene, this is all done through that wiping process, in the same way that for Rembrandt, he's using the wiping, the selective wiping, to show that kind of beam of light that still remains over the central figure of Christ, that brings our attention more forcefully towards him and leaves the other figures in the shadow. So yes, absolutely. And I was speaking, I'm sure, too quickly, but yes, those are two sides of the same coin. If you don't wipe, it's just straight black. So in fact, that variable etching technique is all about that interplay of finding form from the material of the ink and what it suggests on the plate. Totally.
Yeah. Like you said, this intimate nature, you know, there's also several comments about how it creates this voyeuristic kind of storytelling, you know, this intimacy where you feel like a voyeur on the outside, where everything, I mean, even with Rembrandt, you could see that in Entombment, like how they use the tonality to obscure what you're looking at and make you like look harder. So yeah, I mean, brilliant talk today, Z. Really fascinating. I apologize to everyone because we have a ton of questions that we won't be able to get to today, but we'll reach out to people and try to respond to them.
Absolutely, and you can send them all my way, and I can write something. You know, I'm happy to do whatever I can to answer any questions we didn't get to. I really appreciate the interest.
Great, and hopefully we'll have you back for a part 2, because I know, you know, there's so much more that we can talk about here amongst other artists as well in this time period. So yeah, I just want to thank everybody for joining us for tonight's art talk with Z Onuf. And if you're interested, next Thursday, we're actually going to have an artist demo by painter and printmaker Kelly Slater, who's going to do a printing without a press demonstration, kind of in lines of what we were talking about tonight, called Everything But the Kitchen Sink. So I really encourage you to join us for next week's session and to keep an eye on our website for more talks about monotypes and monoprints. So thank you, and thank you, Z.
Thank you.
All right, good night.
Good night.